Welcome back, everybody, to another Growth Support episode. My name is Neil, and today I am joined by Eberlein to talk about support content. We've nerded out a bunch over the past year or so, I would say, about all things support content and what it entails and how what makes it different and how you can make it better. But I'm not going to dive too deep into it. Mari, do you want to introduce yourself and a little bit about your background and where you come from?
Yeah, so I'm Maren. I started my official career in support. It was kind of an easy thing. I had communications major in college, which is like the major of not choosing a major, right? Like it was just fun. And I always liked writing. I live in Chicago. I'd originally moved here because I was like, I'm going to write for TV. It's going to be great. I'm going to take classes at Second City. I'm going to figure it out. And just became apparent really quickly where it's like, oh, I have to like really dedicate to this. I don't need to be a struggling artist. So kind of found my way through the built-in community. If you're based in the US and looking for a job, built-in, we have like built-in Chicago, that's a great place to look for roles. And they had this was pre-COVID, but they had a hiring event. And I met someone from the recruiting team there and it all kind of worked out. And I mean, I'm already that's what I do. But basically I grew up in a family business, in a small family business. So I always kind of understood from a very young age the importance of the support experience and like how you can support people. And especially, I mean, my family's business is still there. And I know a lot of that is because they provide an experience that online shopping cannot provide, right? It's that community, that one-on-one support from the sales associates, and it's not like a commission type thing. It's just a small boutique store, and there's people who only shop there because they trust the employees, they trust the store's quality. Like there's a lot that goes into it, right? So it's like I saw that from a young age. We have those repeat customers and those people who always come in and they feel like that store is part of their, it's part of their circle. It's just one of their things. And so the way that I saw my mom and my grandmother running the store, I think that made a pretty big impression, and I was always had a knack for it, right? So when I was looking for roles to like land that first office job, I knew that support was the way to go. And I ended up at a company that does legal immigration, employment-based immigration. And so that was pretty cool. So it was the tech platform and also learning about all of that and kind of working my team in a space like that. There is a lot of information that is involved in, if anyone has ever gone through any kind of immigration process, it's complex. And when you add a tech platform on top of it, where your users are used to like just working one-on-one with an attorney, they're not used to a platform and kind of navigating that, kind of figured out really early on the impact of useful content. And I kind of knew that was the path that I wanted to go even before I started kind of moving up the team. And by the time I was leading the team, I had known about this horrible FAQ page. I'm sure everyone has, if not encountered one, had to work with one at some point, where it was just like the marketing team had helped put together these FAQs years ago. I think it was about a 2.0 version of the platform, and they were about to release a 4.0. And I was friends with one of the UX designers, and he knew about these. And I was like, oh yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I'd love to work on it with you. And so we started piecing it together. It kind of got pushed off to the wayside for like a year or two. And then all of a sudden, right, so this was my talk at the SD Expo in Vegas this year. It was literally, it happened to me. Our COO was like, self-serve support. We need that. And
out of the blue, hey, that's it.
Self-serve support. We need it. And again, this was pre-COVID, pre-AI and everything. It was just like they suddenly kind of saw, right? Like that was kind of the trend before chatbots took over every conversation about content. But yeah, so luckily I was like, hey, I have already worked on this. We have this thing. So I kind of was able, because I'd done that groundwork it was just literally a friendship with the UX designer. That's my big advice to anyone in support, by the way. Even if you're an introvert, like go to the events, do the networking within your company. It's so important, especially if you want to like either move forward within the support team. It's always good to have those relationships because they pay back in dividends. You're going to learn things from people on other teams that you wouldn't have if you weren't friendly with them. But also if you're trying to transition into another department, great way to learn what it's like in those departments. I mean, I know support, that's kind of why I landed there too. I was like, I know I'm good at support. I don't know that this is what I want to do forever, but I know I can do this, right? And I think a lot of people start that way. The internal networking can even just look like being extra nice in your emails and actually like caring about the person on the other end. And they'll start to recognize like who that particularly friendly person was coming. You know, it's like they'll read the email if you're a little bit nicer in it. I remember
an enjoyable person to work with.
Yeah. I was like, I remember making friends kind of, I think I met her in person once, our one of the vendors that we worked with, because I would always find when I was doing the Second City classes, I was working at Nordstrom, just like on the service experience team, and loved that. But I had to leave for a lot of reasons. And but I worked part-time for the first 6 months when I got my full-time job. And I think I mentioned to one of the guys in the store when I was working one weekend that I worked in this, and he's like, oh, do you know this person who works in that industry? And I was like, oh my God, that's one of our vendors. So then I started getting fun facts from him, and this is really weird of me, but it was honestly really effective too. But it was like, I kind of would like pick up, like, not in a creepy way, but just he'd be like, oh yeah, we did this and this with Nancy. And I'd be like, oh, okay. By the way, happy birthday. Like, I think I found out it was her birthday or something. And I was like, by the way, Dale told me it was your birthday. And then it just kind of like went from there. But then it was great because if I ever needed anything from her, like I never really made mistakes, but also was friendly like that. And so like if I ever needed anything, I mean, she was always like, she was the best.
Favors in the bucket.
Vendors that just like touch your soul in the best way. And she was one of those. So it's not like I needed a favor necessarily from her because she would do it without. Yeah. But it goes like that too, I think, for internal people, like make friends with people, mention things in emails, obviously focus on doing your job well first. That is the most important thing. Like, don't start doing that within your first like 6 months in a role. But once you start building those relationships, you can have those little personal connections and things and be helpful when you can. And I always call it, it's social currency, right? Like little favors here and there. And just, you got your buddy in this department, and now whenever there's a finance problem, you've got somebody in finance who can help you out with a question, or on the legal team, or what. I mean, I made sure it wasn't really on purpose, but I kind of made sure I knew people everywhere so that if something came up, it became really helpful when I started doing content work, because I was good friends with the person who ran marketing, who previously was handling all of those and kind of was still handling it's still an FAQ page, but we made it like a intuitive one, which was really cool.
Nice.
So proud of what we did there. Anyway, yeah. So
going from family business, really understanding the relationships with customers and how they're built and the usefulness of those relationships, finding support and being able to take on some of these early projects and get in when your CEO says, hey, we need that thing. And then building those relationships internally with your friends and teams and colleagues at work kind of helps you to gather all this information from the team. When did you start, knowing that support content was such a niche and an important thing to be able to have a deep understanding of?
So when I left my role at that organization, it's been almost 3 years now. I wanted to really focus on the content side of things, and they were kind of going in a different direction. And I originally, I left with a plan to get a UX writing certification, because I've been doing a lot of work with the product team as well. So I was working with the FAQs and with marketing, onboarding, and webinars and stuff, but I was also working with the product team on some different like notification projects, strings within the platform. We had this like, oh God, working in an industry that is dictated by government decisions is a good time. And I remember helping, it was me and one of the product analysts and one of the attorneys that had to get an entire new case variant out within it was less than a month. It was crazy. So I basically like did all of the copy for this, because it was also like a really tricky thing. And I knew, I'm like, look, I know our users, they're going to have questions about this. This is really touchy, and they're going to want advice on all of it. We have to give more context within the tooltips and stuff. Like, this is so important. And luckily I was in a good place with those teams as well as my manager, where they really trusted me on that. So that was good. Yeah, so I thought I was going that route of just UX writing, and I knew I could make an impact on the user experience that way, right? Like in a lot of ways, content is content. But as I was leaving, I got the opportunity to work with, basically I work as a kind of a Zendesk consultant subcontractor at this point. So we had hired someone out. My team was on Zendesk, and then I was our Zendesk admin as well. And our finance team was doing an instance, and I was like, I can't figure this out. Whatever. So I was kind of helping, but we hired them to help us get their instance figured out. And when I was telling him I was leaving, I just, like, hey, this is who's taking over. I'm heading out. He's like, oh, what are you going to do? And I was like, well, I know I want to do something with content. This is the plan. He's like, we should talk. And so after my last day and everything had wrapped up, so his team it's the plant management. I don't know if it matters. They do Zendesk optimization and implementation for things like they get referrals from Zendesk, whatever. But all of his team is pretty much like project managers, developer type people. They work with the dashboards. They help do they can do a lot of custom stuff in Zendesk, that kind of thing. But none of them they're very much like techie people. But one of the products of the Zendesk suite is the guide, which is their CMS. And his team, he's like, yeah, we'll make it look nice for people. But a lot of them will ask if we can fix the content. And they're like, that is not our thing. And he was like, but if you want to come on board, we can tell them yes, and you can start taking on some projects, because we've been working together enough at that point. He knew it was a really great transition. He's been the best cheerleader of just I know that your work, right, is have you heard that from people where it's like your 40-60% is better than most people's 100%. You're going to figure it out. You're not going to do bad work. And that's where those relationships and, being genuine with people, I think has really served me well. In that people, I am an overshare. It's I've got my little mug. I'm an overshare and overthinker, and I don't do a great job of hiding that sometimes, and people recognize it, but I think people know it's it's not great sometimes, but also it's I'm going to do good work for you though. That that's a very high standard for myself that is far and above what anyway. So when I was working with him, because my only experience really had been doing the FAQs with that, and I just kind of intuitively understood that we needed some kind of layer of organization for those FAQs, and how do we break it down? How do we make it more navigable? How can we group things so that my team could send people that way? Because how many new users do you have where it's they're just chatting to kind of get familiar? They have maybe one question, but they're just not used to your product, and they kind of just want to know what's going on and what to do. And I want to help those people. I want to chat with them and answer every question, but that's not a good use of my time or theirs, because I don't know what, so they don't necessarily know what to ask at that point either. So I was like, what can we do? Okay, let's have one page that focuses on all questionnaire questions and onboarding questions, that kind of thing. So it was we can send them there. And I knew I wanted everything to link to each other, so that if they had a further question about this thing, they could click it and find, maybe it was about their dependents, which we separated, but it's all there. And we really were intentional about landing pages, things like that. So I knew, and it was really effective. We saw it working really well from a pretty early point, the revenue. That's those metrics that are so hard to find, right? It's we knew that the number of users was growing, and obviously the number of tickets was growing, but at the same time, there weren't spikes in the areas that we were really targeting, right? You can kind of compare general ticket volume with certain topics, and where normally they would follow the spikes in normal volume, they were kind of staying consistent, because our team could turn those long chats into quick one touch, here's the answer to your question, anything else? And they say, oh yeah, I'm kind of can you give me some information about how this case process will go? No problem. Here's a link to this resource. Many of our users find it helpful.
Everything you need. Yeah.
And you can always chat us again if you have any further questions, or you can always I'm happy to send you a follow-up email if you have any further questions, right? But most of the time the content takes care of it. And even if they have a follow-up question, it's usually something that's more specific from the user, right? Because they don't necessarily know what they're asking it for. So a lot of times the help center and your support content is where we get into all the benefits of it. One of the things is that someone told me once when I was doing all my research with all this, that the future is search experience, right? You don't need to worry about layout anymore. You don't need to worry about organization, because people are just going to search or talk to a chat bot. And I'm okay, first of all, the organization and the layout informs those tools. Also, you can't discount there are users who are going to browse. There are people like I'm a browser. I'm going to search if I have a specific question, but if I'm just getting to know a product, I'm going to click around and see what's going on. I'm going to try and get familiar with like, what does this organization want me to know about their product? That's where like those categories, those featured articles, whatever that is, like it's good to have that. I like for anyone who doesn't have a get started guide, you should have a get started guide, and it should be prominently featured somewhere so that, because who's going to browse? Your new users. Have something for them to go to so that they have an idea of what's going on. Don't make it 100 years long though. Like have it just like kind of quick snippets. I did it for EVgo and PlugShare. Both that was where we've seen so much success with that, where they can send people that way. It's a featured article. It's one of their top viewed and top upvoted, where it's just like the basic steps to use the platform, not from start to finish, but like through the main features and the main reasons why someone would want to use it. So we start with something, like sign up, log in, update your account, like card payment details, things like that. But then we okay, it's like, what are the main features? Well, finding chargers, they're EV charging. So it's like finding chargers. We want to make sure that's kind of on there. Like PlugShare had a navigation, a really cool like navigation feature. I think it's like the gas buddy of EVs is what I tell people. It's really cool. But that was something that we wanted people to know about. So it was like, well, we don't want to overwhelm with a long list of things that have long descriptions. So we do like the header with maybe a sentence or two. And I've changed how I do this over time. I think everyone should, the best help centers are iterative, where you kind of continue to improve it over time as you see like, okay, this confused people, we should tweak this sentence. Or in the case of like of PlugShare EVgo, it's like a parent-child company, and we did PlugShares first, and then with EVgo we found out they have a really nice help center theme. Like, oh, well, we could do this for PlugShare, but they're like, no, it's working, the content's working. We're like, okay. There's times where it's like the maintenance thing is hard from a consulting perspective, because honestly, like once some intentional content is put up there, you're gonna see the benefits right away. That's something that I guess I should backtrack a little bit, because I jumped ahead.
Let's set some definitions real quick.
I come in like a freight train.
Let's go. When you talk about support content, there's a wide variety of support content. We mentioned FAQs, we mentioned help center, knowledge base. What would you define as a differentiator for what support content actually is when you say content?
So that's such a hard question, not because of the content necessarily. It's because of the way that I think help centers and support content have been handled. It's a very reactive thing, right? At any organization, even like a CMS provider or support platform, like maybe they were thinking about their support content from day one, but I'm assuming it's very unlikely, right? Like when a company first starts up, they're worried about sales, they're worried about whatever. And I mean, I think support feels this too. It's often maybe not an afterthought, but definitely a reactive part, like arm of the organization.
And the reason I started our help center the first time was because I was trying to scale myself as a support person. And that's why we started creating content, right?
So, I mean, I know like when I was at Envoy, the FAQ project was huge for customer facing, but I was playing a massive role in the internal knowledge management of the support team because of some different technical limitations. We couldn't use the Zendesk guide for user-facing content, but we very much started relying on it for our internal content. And I was kind of applying the same ideas of like, we need to get it organized, we need to train the team on using it, knowing what's available, getting it integrated properly with tickets, things like that. And we saw a great improvement in like, especially the people who used it consistently and were newer and learning, it was showing some good benefits. So there's a lot of things that kind of have to come together, right? So when we think about content in general, this is where it's like, I was in the support world. That's where I kind of came up, and I was delegated the support content, I think partially because our organization did not have any content designers. We had a marketing team and copywriters. That was the only content role within the org. And I think that's pretty common. And so when the COO, self-serve support, well, that support team, you can do that. And so I was basically managing the team, and that was kind of like my director knew that I was interested in the content stuff, and I already whatever. So I just kind of took that over like every other hat, right? A lot of us wear all of those hats. There's another one. And so I was very much not necessarily in control, but very much active in our internal like team content as well as the user facing content. We were doing some big email campaigns for that reason. We were working with some other stuff. When I kind of transitioned out of that role and was in this, okay, it's like, okay, I am a content person now. What does that mean, right? Like I'm like, what do I call myself? Whatever. I was just kind of working on stuff and I was doing more and more research. Like I did the certification course and I got a lot of use from the UX writing course because I had never heard of a style guide. And I was like, this makes a lot of sense. Style guide, duh. And then I was doing more and more research. I think at one point I was struggling with something on a project and I ended up finding content strategy. I hadn't heard of that really as a thing. And I think I had talked with a mentor on ADP List about it because I was just like, you know, I'm working on their content. I know what I want to do, but every time I try to do something, I'm finding more mess with other teams. And am I doing something wrong? And she was just like, content strategy is like peeling back an onion. More layers to it. It's like you're not necessarily the problem. It's just like in general, content is like just like support can be very reactive. So is content. Like they're thinking about marketing and sales content. They're not always thinking about like product teams are focused on developing the product, which they should. That's why we have content designers and we can work together to make it better together, right? And so that's where it was interesting of like, I kind of pivoted into the content world for a while. So then I volunteered at Confab, which was one of the best things I ever did. And like, it's a content strategy conference that is no more, but there's others out there, right? It's like I went to a conference, I met a lot of content people. I started reading some different content strategy books and was kind of embedded in that space for a while. I was learning more and more about technical writing as well. And kind of realized like I was kind of cobbling together different practices from different things because I feel like I was searching for something that didn't exist, right? I was searching for like, how do I make a help center better? How, like, am I supposed to open the link in a new tab or not? Like little things, as well as like, how do I make sure that this is working for the search stuff so that it comes up when people search for it, or it comes up when they, right? Like when you submit a ticket and it'll suggest articles, like how do I make sure the right articles come up, that kind of thing. So I was doing a lot of that too. And every practice I learned about, like similar with the UX writing, like, okay, great guidance on headers and patterns and style guides and things like that. But obviously the whole practice doesn't apply. It's ultimately UX writing is short form content. That's an easy distinction. Marketing copy, again, like they also focus on style guidelines. They are a little more into the long form content as well as like, I mean, when you're dealing with the new user onboarding, first impressions are everything. And I know I heard about this all the time, the concept of like death by 1,000 cuts, right? Like appearances matter. That can be a cut if it just looks, if it doesn't match, like not just the content style guidelines, but like the visual style guidelines. If it looks different than the marketing site and the product, this help center, that can be a red flag for some users. And like if the layout is confusing, so it's like there's certain marketing copy concepts that I was trying to apply and hold on to, but it's obviously not marketing, right? Like I'm trying to provide informative, helpful. I'm not selling something. So that was the distinction.
It's
there.
Very practical, right?
Right. So then you get into the ones where it's a little bit closer. So when I break up this stuff, I'm like, you know, I feel like the people who work with help center, so the reason I call it a help center, I did this for the course because I used to have been like, is it a knowledge base? Is it a support site? Is it any combination of those words? I literally just did a Google Trends comparison search, and help center was very much the most searched of like people around the world. So I call it a help center. If it is user facing, I call it a help center. And that is that.
Because it's internal, maybe knowledge base.
Right. And I like the idea of having the distinction, even if they live in the same space. If you have internal content as well as user facing content in the exact same, like, you know, those articles could be side by side. If I'm an agent looking at it, I'm seeing both, which I think is kind of ideal if you do it right. I still like the idea of distinguishing the two because they are written differently. They have different purposes. So let's see. So let me get back on my train of thought. So we're talking
we were talking about support content and what makes it distinct in that sense. So like UX writing and development is really short format, really supposed to focus on the platform and the functionality and usage. Marketing has a lot more visual creativity in that sense, much more piecing together to drive behavior. whereas the support content is much more practical, user friendly to really get the job done and also help users to educate themselves in a really nice way.
So then the gray areas come in. I think it's helpful. I need to make this visual of a pie chart of like, I think in general, the people who work on help centers, I think that the way that you manage it and the way that it looks and feels, the way that it's viewed at your org has a lot to do with just like previous whatever, not anything to whatever. So I like to think it's like, if you put it in a pie chart of thirds, you have like a third of the people are going to be support teams who often kind of conflate knowledge management and support content, which to a degree is accurate, but I'm going to expand on that in a minute. Then you have about a third of the people are technical writing, which is, technical writing for end users, which is not incorrect, especially your more technical organizations where like if it's a, product for developers, absolutely it's technical, that kind of thing. And then the other third is that mix of like UX writers who also have to work with the, that's UX Content Collective wanted to do this course on support content because they were getting UX writers who they'd certified come back to them and say, hey, I'm responsible for the UX copy on this new feature. They also want me to write the Help Center articles about this new feature. Do you have anything on that? And so there is that need there. It's just kind of like, I think organizations like, okay, well, where do the content people currently live? Let's give more of that to them. Because there's marketing people that do it too. So that extra third is like a combination of marketing, of UX product, like content designers, product managers. You get like education if your team has, or if your org has like a learning team or a like instructional design team, kind of a mishmash of everyone else is like that other third. That's kind of how I see it. And I feel like it's still kind of predominantly in that space. So the things.
I was going to say, I think that like that's also, I mean, what you mentioned at the beginning, where you need to make friends throughout the organization. You need to build those relationships as well, because so many people are working on content and being able to kind of really add that value for you. And it could just live in different places within your org. Like it is very important to build those relationships and walk through it.
The easy distinctions, right? We talked about like the UX, whatever. So when you get into knowledge management and technical writing, with technical writing, I've always viewed that as developer documentation. If you Google technical writing, a lot of that is there. Like it came out of like user manuals for your fancy new computer in the 80s or whatever. Like it started with that, and it's kind of still very much a thing. And I think that, technical writing for end users is certainly a way to look at it. But at the end of the day, I know that I don't have this. If I define technical writing as like developer documentation, I don't think I have the skill set to do that. So I'm not comfortable calling myself a technical writer, and technical writer for end users is a mouthful, but also like there's different priorities because I'm really focused on specific functionality. I love, I've brought this up with you once before and I'm not going to get into it. The concept of diataxis. If you go on my website, I think, Neil, can you put a link in it and I will
do it.
It's a whole thing. I'm not going to get into the details, but
we could go into an entire whole nother conversation just on that one topic.
Like you need to do the talk circuit with this article because basically the concept of diataxis is very cool. It was developed from a technical writing perspective. And the one distinction he makes, which of course I missed early on, and like as I was really looking closely in this article, I talk about it, is that he talks about how diataxis is meant for the audience is a practitioner of a skill, basically. I'm not saying that quite right, but practitioners of a skill. And to me, I'm like, that right there is the distinction of technical writing, is that technical writers are writing for people who have a known or assumed or necessary skill set. And so leaving out all the other bits of diataxis that make that relevant, like to me, I'm like, that's a really good distinction between technical writing and end user documentation, because when I'm writing for end users, especially for B2C products, but also for a lot of B2B stuff, like I don't know who I'm writing for. I'm always in my head of like, okay, there's a spectrum of people. I've got my developers, my highly technical on one end of this spectrum. I have my grandmother on the other end of this spectrum. And I fall somewhere in between, maybe on the slightly more technical side of it, but every possible person who could read my content falls along this spectrum. And that's the difference, right? Like I have to assume, I can't assume that they know certain information. So to me, that's the key differentiation, is that audience between technical writing and whatever. So it's like, to me, I'm like, if you have a really technical product, like I think Zapier is a good example of that, where they do a lot of integrations and things. They have people like me, or like not, they have like, to a certain degree, there's a technical ability there. My grandmother, though, is definitely not about to use Zapier. There's no way. There's no reason. There's no way. So
why not?
like, level of expertise to use that product, right? And like, there's I think I need to look closer. I like their documentation when I've looked at it, especially their marketing resources. But it's that combination of those things. And that's the thing too, is like, support content is not, by defining it as its own thing, I'm not trying to create another silo or another like monolithic thing. To me, I'm like, support content is basically, it means that the help center is your primary deliverable. That doesn't mean you're not working with other teams and other practices and other deliverables, because the support content skill set can apply to other things like tooltips or whatever. So that's kind of where that is. So that other third is that knowledge management piece. And I know a lot of support teams really relate to knowledge management. And it's probably because a lot of support people or managers are put in my situation, right? Where it's like, I manage the support team and I'm also responsible for the content. I'm potentially probably using the same CMS to hold all of that content. So I just kind of group it together. And if I'm, frankly, I know as a support manager, while I care a lot about the end user stuff, making sure that my team has the resources to answer the questions that come in front of them is my priority, right? Like, at the end of the day, when I'm managing a support team, the tickets are the priority, the agents are the priority, making sure they have what they need and they're trained up and we're not going to have any issues. And especially in immigration legal tech, it's a big problem if someone says the wrong thing or something they're not supposed to say. So that was really important. So that was ultimately my priority, really. And so that's why I think those get conflated in support communities, is that you're working with your own team's knowledge base, knowledge management, but then you're also working with the end user stuff, and they just kind of come together. And it feels like the difference is just a visibility thing on certain articles, right? It's like, well, end users can see this and only agents can see this one, but and I'm like, yes and no. There's a lot of why. I love, I've done a lot of digging into KCS. I think that's when we first kind of talked, as you were to the fireside, and I'd reached out and I was like, this is so cool. And see, this is where networking, just being nice to people. I feel like that was like that, where I was kind of like, I was really impressed with how you've done this thing. And I was like, I'm just going to say something. Why not? And you're the type of person who's like, yeah, let's chat. Because I'm that type of person. And it's like, if it sticks, it sticks. Anyway, oh my God, tangents. So sorry, I'm going to get back on track. Yeah, so basically, when I was diving into some of the KCS stuff, I was like, I love their methods for using support to create new articles, whether those are user facing or internal. I love the way that like attaching articles gives you even more data, because it's so hard to get any kind of metrics about support content specifically. Content in general is really hard to measure, right? It's a qualitative thing, not a quantitative thing. But we have to speak leadership's language. We need to have those qualitative or quantitative ways to talk about stuff. So it's difficult, but like I think like having that access and those maintenance flows and the way they kind of look at it is, it's very iterative. It's a very agile thing that's constantly whatever. I love the concept of crowdsourcing your content, because at the end of the day, I would rather a support agent make a mediocre update on an article than wait for me to phrase it just perfectly. And then there's outdated information while it sits there and waits for me to phrase it perfectly. I'd rather that support agent, within reason, like they're talking to customers. They're also like, there's lots of support content principles that support agents naturally should and generally do have, right? Like putting your users first, making sure that you're available. Like that's a thing. That's something that I really try to, like the tenets of that. So that's where it's like, I like borrowing some of the stuff from knowledge management in terms of like, whether that's KCS or otherwise, different ways of looking at things. I like using a lot of the print, like I love the diataxis principle. That's all technical writing. And there's some other technical writing things that I've definitely like pulled from to kind of create this thing. And I think there's other people out there who've probably done this too. And then I'm just like, I've accidentally got lucky and kind of found a platform to talk about it. And that's been the beauty of consulting, is I have the time. I'm not managing a support team anymore. And so, because there's been a lot of people where they'll read certain things that I share, or like some of our beta testers were like, oh my God, thank you. Someone's finally one beta tester who left really, really thorough comments, and I so appreciate them. Because I remember Patrick, who's at UXCC work on the course with me, who's like, this one, there's a lot of comments. Don't take it too personally. They left a lot of comments for you. And I'm like, I used that version of the beta to look at when I was redrafting stuff. I was like, I want to know everything they said. I love it. I'm like, we're all just making it up. That's been one thing too that's so funny, where it's like I keep getting reminded, especially now with AI, it's like we're all just figuring things out and making things up as we go. And it's like, if you're trying to do right by users and you're trying to help other people, others are going to get on board. And if it makes sense, right? It's like, I don't want to sit here and say I'm just making all these things up. I think
it comes back to a lot of experience and research.
I have a lot of experience and a lot of research. And that's where I feel like I'm still so green in a lot of ways. I've very much only worked with like small, medium orgs, but I think that's where this is important too. So the other piece of like the technical writing is once you get to that enterprise level, and I was just listening to the content strategy pod with Larry Swanson, which I love, by the way. And they talk a lot about there's another guy that I love learning from with Scott Abel, who does the Content Wrangler. And they both talk a lot about structured content, and that's where you do like markdown and DITA and XML, and like there's like structured componentized content stuff. And that's all well and good when you work at a massive enterprise org who is not only willing to invest in all the work that is required to set something like that up, but also like has a need for it. There's a point where like I think orgs hit a threshold, and it's not necessarily all enterprise orgs, because I have some friends now that I've met at enterprise org that you would know and think enterprise, where they're operating the same way a medium-sized org is operating. I think a lot of it depends on the product that you're offering. If you have a lot of products too, because like look at something like Adobe, where they have how many different products within their system. So they're going to need something that's a little bit more complex and invested in their content, where like something a little bit simpler is going to have a pretty basic help center. And that's okay. And so that's where I think that there's not enough people talking about this space where I'm working in a small, medium, even enterprise something. I just need a very basic help center that's optimized as much as possible for machine learning, for searches, but also if we were to need to move on to a more complex, componentized content ecosystem later on, like how can we optimize for that now at this small stage? And that's where a lot of the course talks about that. So the course of UXCC, you mentioned it a little bit. It's being released December 9th. It's very exciting. And it's basically, for me, a lot of things that it was great in terms of it put me in a unique position to really research a lot of this stuff. There were a lot of topics that just like I knew I wanted to know more about, but it wasn't directly relevant to the contracting work that I was doing. And so I'd never really had a chance to dive in. So I really got to dive into some stuff, especially about structures and about article types, which I know is top of mind for a lot of us. And yeah, I feel like I'm very lucky that I got to do that. And I don't know, I like to talk a lot about things like this. So I guess I'm trying to I'm over here like in the back of my mind, okay, next year I want to maybe try and find a space for support content people. Because a lot of us, I know myself, it's like I'm somewhere in between all these content communities and the support community. Because support cannot be left out of that conversation. Who is the most direct? That's where there was part of the conversation too. It's an article I'm working on that I need to publish before the course is out. But the concept of support content and where it should live, who should own it. There's a great article by Jason, I forget his last name, but maybe I'm going to send you a bunch of links that you can hopefully put in a description. But he did it was a quick little article just about who writes the docs, who owns the docs, or who runs the docs. Yeah. It's a really good perspective of how the way that your organization works influences the way that you work with documentation and who you work with and how it's handled. And that's something I really wanted to capture in the course too, is personally, I want to call what I do support content, where my primary deliverable is a help center. And I work with other teams. I work with other things as well. But ultimately, I'm focused on the help center. And I love the idea of working somewhere within, if there's not a content function that exists independently, and I had to choose another function to work underneath, I'd much prefer to be closer to support. So closer in operations, even within the support team. And I think a lot of people do that, but that's where I see it, because the reason for that is, if any technical writers are out there, documentation teams are great, but they're usually most closely aligned with the product. My content is most, after maybe even more than users, is going to impact support agents, because in an ideal world, support agents are actually going to look at that content and learn from it and use it, because you want to make sure that agents are saying the same thing that your content is saying, right? Like, you want to have that seamless experience. But also, if the content goes wrong, who's going to get notified about it? Who's going to get the angry chat or phone call or email because they tried to do a thing this article told them to do and it didn't work? So I'm like, I think that it needs to be closest to the team that's most impacted by it, which is, to me, without a doubt, the support team. Product and all that is impacted too, but like, it's not going to interrupt product's day. Like, yeah, they might fix something because the content or the user found something, blah, 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 and you put in the request, but like, it can mess up the support. If there's a release that goes out and it's a problem, or there's an article that's about a major release that goes out that's contradictory, like, we've all had those things where it's like, great, one word just messed up our entire queue is now flooded with questions about this one thing because there was a miscommunication about like how something would work. Or a big one is like marketing promotions with the clients that I've worked with, where they have a lot of issues with that. So it's like, that's where when it works best, you're working and talking with content people from all other walks of your organization, but ultimately it's functioning within support, because when you need to take quick action, when those like emergency things happen, I feel like those people, that needs to be their priorities. Because if marketing owns that content, while they certainly do care about users and retention and things like that, their priority is marketing. Their priority is the next sales thing. It's prospects. So it makes sense that they would put support content on the back burner. The same thing with like documentation. If there's an upcoming release and they're focused on getting documentation for that new feature out, that's what they need to focus on. That's their priority. It's not necessarily an article they wrote a month ago that's now causing issues. So that's why I think living in support is so important. Because
I really appreciate you sharing your experience and kind of going through the journey of support content and where you're at, and like why it's so important to have that as close to users, and what's really the key components that differentiate it. I think it's a really great way for people to meet it and also explore a career in support content and what makes it different. If people were interested in continuing that conversation and really connecting with you to learn a little bit more, is there a best place that they could do that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm working on getting a newsletter sort of going. LinkedIn is good. I'm the only one of me. So, and then my website is contentbymfe.com. Check out my long diataxis article.
Which is very helpful. I've referenced it quite a few times.
Putting your user needs first, as long as you are being as predictable as possible, whether like in all the ways that structure can exist in terms of like layout, terminology, things like that. And then you just do something, just do it. Don't wait around for the perfect thing. Just do the thing. Like, that is the biggest takeaways for all of it. It's like, just do something and start small. That's like, it's hot, fun tip back. I don't know if you're going to include any of this tangenty mess.
I think it's a great meet meeting, like wonderful conversation to learn your journey. I would say
It's like, I am an open book that is
absolutely
mostly just notes.
I love it. It's great. But I really appreciate it. Thank you. And it's always fun to chat with you and to be able to learn more and go on wild tangents and understand a lot more about what's going on in the support content world. In that case, we'll leave them with some exploratory, exciting news. And I really appreciate you joining and having a conversation.
Thank you for having me, because